Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel that is presented by Traces.Dreams. I'm here today in this new episode on inequalities and things related to inequalities with Jakob Silas Lund. Jakob is an old friend, not because he's old, but because we know each other for, I've been thinking, almost 20 years now. And we met originally at mock UN conference where we were fighting for a better world and global justice and equality. Is that right?
I believe that's what we were fighting for, yeah.
And that was back in Denmark. Welcome, Jakob, to the show.
Thank you very much.
Jakob is currently a stay-at-home dad and author, and also he's a consultant for international development organizations of various kinds. And Jakob has specialty of research area of writing about a topic that he's called reconciliation or peace building. And I would like you, Jakob, to explain to us what this topic means, what it has to do with issues like forgiveness that concern all of us human beings at some point or another, and what your work around reconciliation entailed.
Thank you for having me and for that introduction. Actually, just earlier today, I started working on a new project in a part of Nairobi that's called Kariobangi, which is a bit of I guess you could call it a slum area, where we are I'm working with a group of local young men and women working to start a project on, let's call it youth empowerment in Kariobangi. And we were discussing different challenges that they face in this community, one of them being the prominence of what they call gangsters, or, just thugs, criminal young men in the community, and how to best kind of deal with that challenge. And I brought up a saying from Sierra Leone, where, as you know, I've done a lot of work over the past,
20 years?
Yeah, very long time. And there's a saying that has really stayed with me since I heard it for the first time a very long time ago. And in Creole, which is the local language in Sierra Leone, it goes, "Bush no de fatrowe bat pikin," which means there's no bush, there's no place where you can throw away a bad child. And the point of that is, when someone grows up in your community, and when someone is part of that community and starts acting in a bad way or committing crimes in the Sierra Leonean context, it could be when that person becomes part of a rebel group and kills or rapes someone in your very community, that's horrible, but there's really no place you can throw away that person. Unless, of course, you are a proponent of just radical death penalty to anyone who commits a crime, you're going to have to reckon with that person one way or another. Even if you put the person to jail, he or she's going to come out again. And so that concept of saying, you are part of our community and we have to deal with that, doesn't mean we think it's okay what you did. It doesn't mean that we will just move on after you raped my mother or burned down my house, but it means we have to deal with each other one way or another. And I found that to be in one sense, it's very basic, it's very common sense, but it's also kind of mind-blowing for someone like myself coming from a society, and Denmark isn't even obviously the worst in this sense, but coming from a society where kind of the first inkling people have when an injustice has been committed towards them or anyone really is how, who did this and how can we punish them and how hard can we punish them oftentimes. And it just seems to me that, and I'm obviously not the first one to think about this, that kind of punitive justice, if we call it that, it isn't really sustainable. It doesn't lay the groundworks for any of the implicated parties to have a better life. It's very rare, I think, that someone will say, I was wronged and I'm deeply hurt and I miss my mother, or I'm poor because my house or my farm was burned down or whatever. But at least the person who did it is in prison, so I actually feel kind of great. I don't think that's how the human mind luckily operates. And so to bring it back to what you mentioned about, we could call it restorative justice, we could call it reconciliation, we can call it peace building, is to recognize that these people are most likely, unless they're complete strangers who are never going to see each other again, And even so, they're most likely going to have to deal with each other one way or another. And even if they are strangers when they're going to see each other again, they will live rent-free in one another's head. And that's particularly true for victims of crimes or injustices. And so finding some way for them or for us to be able to live together, either literally in the same village as it was in Sierra Leone, the kind of work I did there, or figuratively in the same space or even mental space, I think is just hugely important. And to perhaps just bring it back, this long answer to the conversation I had earlier today in Kariobangi, what some of these young people told me was part of the reason why these gangsters, these thugs, operate the way they do is that they know how they're perceived when they come in with their clothes and their bling bling, as they call it. They know how people perceive them. They won't take them seriously. They won't respect them. So they might as well just, gain respect by crime or by violence. And they never have a voice to actually talk to the rest of the community and kind of show themselves from a different side. And so I think, this is post-conflict or, brutal war as it was in Sierra Leone. It's in a slum area of Nairobi, but it's also just in traffic in Copenhagen or in, on the sidewalks or in a romantic relationship in New York or Ciudad de Mexico or whatever. I think we all encounter these instances where we feel wronged or we wrong someone, and we have to figure out how to live with that and how to coexist with that. So yeah, that was a long answer to when you ask me what my relationship is to those concepts or how I feel about them. It is something I feel very strongly about, and it's something particularly that I think I feel strongly about because it's a very, very powerful tool or approach or mindset that is actually free. You don't have to set up huge sector programs or install new kinds of technology or build roads or anything like that. You can actually sit down and talk to one another. That's free and that's available to us if we make use of it.
I know you have a very strong personal and professional relationship to these concepts. I don't know whether you could briefly mention how you personally experienced this in part of your life, and then how you translated that to some degree into your work with an organization that you built called Play 31 in Sierra Leone.
Sure, yeah. I think it might be the other way around, though.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the starting point is that I had a sister who was killed in a car accident almost 20 years ago. And obviously that was a traumatic and horrible experience for me and one that I kind of have carried with me in all that time. And I think it probably did propel me in some directions and perhaps gave me or kind of enforced on me some kind of empathy with people who experience traumatic experiences in their lives. I don't know, but I think that's probably the case. Either way, I carried that with me, and I started my professional life or professional career in Sierra Leone first as a volunteer for a local organization. Then, as you mentioned, I ended up setting up an organization that worked there, focusing on reconciliation and peace building using sports and other tools as a way to bring together people who had been torn apart by the civil war in Sierra Leone. And it really was kind of not just a game changer, but I think a life changer for me to sit around a big bonfire and witness people who had been fighting each other or killing each other or raping each other in that war, standing up and confronting one another. And as I mentioned before, figuring out how they could best live together and how they could ask for forgiveness, those who genuinely repented. That repentance sounds like such a religiously loaded word, but it doesn't have to be. That really is something that kind of changed something in my hardware, I think, in my thinking about really what human beings are, what we're made of and what we're capable of, both in the extreme evil end of the spectrum and in the very compassionate end of the spectrum. So I carried that with me, and I didn't make a very explicit, for some reason that seems odd now, but I didn't make a very explicit link to my own experience of having lost my sister. And she died in a car accident where one car hit the car that she was sitting in with my dad, and my dad was driving. And it wasn't until probably 2 or 3 years ago now, in 18, I think, that I think I'd never met the guy who drove that other car who hit my sister's car. I'd never met him, but I obviously knew that, he was there, and I knew that his son was with him in the car, and I but it never, I thought a lot about him and who he might be and how that whole event might have impacted him. So anyways, I ended up calling him out of the blue a couple of years ago now, and with really the purpose or the goal to tell him that I forgave him for his role in that accident. Not assigning all the blame to him. It's still unclear exactly what happened in the accident, but to just kind of lift him or lift the feeling of guilt that I imagine might have been weighing on him for those years. And so I called him, and we had a really, I mean, it sounds perhaps strange to say, but it really was a great conversation. And he turned out to be just a really nice person, a really good guy who had indeed been through a lot of torment from that experience. And his son as well. He was 10 years old, the son who was, involved in this fatal accident. And we ended up meeting a couple of months later. I lived in Geneva at the time. And when I came back to Denmark, we met at a cafe and went for a little walk. And, it's the first and only time I've met him, but, we embraced at the end, and we're friends on Facebook now, which again, perhaps sounds strange, but it was just a very powerful experience, I think, both of us. And I think that my work in Sierra Leone influenced my thinking around a very personal, aspect of my own life and how I wanted to deal with that.
It's a very powerful and touching story. And you made a very inspiring podcast and written piece as well about the story. So if you read Danish or if you understand Danish, listen to those, read those. Hopefully you'll write about it in English at some point as well. So other people can listen. We'll link the article in English so you can check it out. I'm wondering, Jakob, do you think this is a scalable solution for post-conflict situations, whatever the conflict might have been originally, right? I mean, it's a powerful tool at the micro level. How can you imagine could this be used on a bigger scale, maybe?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that. And there is some empirical evidence that would suggest that it isn't. In fact, from my native Denmark, there's some evidence that, I forget what the technical term is for it, but the police has had a whole unit, I guess you could call it, that facilitates meetings between perpetrators and victims of, I think, nonviolent crime, or it might have also been violent crime. I'm not sure. Either way, they couldn't show that it actually had a positive impact. I'm not entirely sure about the quality of that study, but it suggests that it isn't just straightforward, that you can just, apply this everywhere. I think it's really interesting, the cultural differences that obviously impact this as well. I'm not an expert on the former Yugoslavia at all, but it's pretty apparent that there are very big differences in terms of how the people in that area have related to both the most recent conflict, but also the historical conflicts that have gone on since, I think, the 1300s in that part of the world, compared to, in Sierra Leone. I've sitting down with people who, 5 or 7 years prior have literally been shooting at each other across from a river over a bridge, and, joking about, do you remember when we finally got your general on that side and he went down? Oh yeah, that was crazy. And having kind of a fraternal conversation about that, something that happened so recently. It's not my impression that would ever happen between a former Serb fighter and a Bosniak fighter or something like that. So I think there are some cultural differences that don't necessarily make it impossible to talk. I don't think it makes it impossible to talk about reconciliation and peace building, but that just means that it's a very different process and very different measures that have to be put in place. There is an organization that works with football as well, like the organization you mentioned, Play 31, that I started, like we did in Sierra Leone. I know that they do that in, I think it's Bosnia as well. So some of the tools might be similar and some of the approaches could be scalable in that sense. But really I feel like I'm approaching 40, and maybe this is time when I'm growing wise, because the only unifying theory that I've developed for anything, for everything in the world that has to do with human beings, is that everything is individual. And it's so difficult to draw any sweeping conclusions about, whether it's child upbringing, child psychology, developmental psychology, or it's post-conflict reconciliation, or it's, anything really that has to do with inner lives of human beings and how we relate to one another. It just seems to me that it's so context specific, and there are so, there are billions of variables that are so difficult to account for in whether something works or doesn't, whether someone is a good teacher, whether someone likes going to school and benefits from being in the educational system has so many different variables that we can always try to copy Finland or South Korea, for that matter, two very different approaches. But we don't know if it would work in Mexico or Kenya or Denmark. Anyways, I'm going on a rant here, but it's just to say that I do think it's scalable. I'm actually convinced that it's scalable, but because I've seen that even in the most extreme circumstances, human beings have it in them to meet one another with an open heart, if I can use such a poetic phrase. But it's not easy, and it's not something you can just take. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach that you can just apply anywhere.
It's a wonderful expression, this meeting with an open heart. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it relates to your role as a writer. And you've written a very touching book about a friend that you met in Sierra Leone that you also approached with an open heart. And he, has an open heart as well, as far as I understand from the book. This communicating process, especially if we consider that everything is individual, how does it work? From one individual to another, how can you create this open-heartedness among individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the pitfalls is, or at least that I've experienced, you mentioned briefly that, I'm working on a book about how different cultures have related and still relate to the concept of forgiveness and what we actually understand when we say forgiveness. For example, can you forgive someone who has died, or can you forgive on behalf of someone who's dead, and so forth. Just to say, I've done a lot of research on this over the past couple of years. And one of the things I've come across is that, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, it's kind of become the realm of religious, particularly Christian thinkers. And it's seen, as I mentioned, with repentance and forgiveness, they're seen oftentimes as religious concepts, which I think is a shame, because the nature of organized religion is to exclude everyone who's not part of it, and particularly people who, like myself, who are a-religious, I think shy away from it because they see it as kind of almost like a holier than thou approach to something that in reality should deserve some more even-handed or heavy-handed even approach. So I think the first challenge, at least in my experience, is to just remove the conversation about forgiveness and reconciliation from a religious realm and from a kind of a spiritual, not that I have anything against spirituality, but just make it a very everyday thing. And I think something I found useful is to talk about self-forgiveness as well, which I find to be a really interesting concept, to be open and honest with yourself and kind of examining. And this is also how I kind of approach this topic over the past many years, is kind of thinking back in my own life and recognizing the times when I've wronged someone or when I've caused injustices, which I think we all have, and being able to kind of understand why I did what I did and where I came from and why that made sense to me at the moment. That makes it so much easier to forgive yourself. And when you apply that approach to other people, it's the exact same thing. Unless people are certified sociopaths, which of course some people are, but very few, they oftentimes act out of a place of emotions that are actually quite understandable and relatable to other people if we make the effort. As you can tell, this is a complex conversation to have. So it's not something, I don't think you could just make a big campaign and put, forgive your neighbor on big billboards all over the place. I think it's much more about these types of conversations that I'm happy, we have the chance to have right now. I think that's what's needed. The way you bring up your kids, the way you relate to your friends and family, the way you relate to yourself, and then have those conversations with as many people as possible. I mean, I feel like I'm proselytizing as much as I can, and and I guess that's how change happens. I'd like to have a magic wand. I thought a lot about, something like two areas of behavioral change, which is drunk driving and the gays. How acceptance has changed within those two areas. Nobody, at least in, that's not true for Kenya, but let's just take Denmark as an example. Nobody drinks and drives anymore. It's not socially acceptable. And nobody is homophobic anymore. That's also not socially acceptable. But that has changed within 20, 30 years very drastically. Some of the other things that I feel strongly about, like reconciliation and I guess forgiveness, how could you affect that kind of change in an equally efficient way? I'm still searching. I don't know.
How do these concepts of reconciliation and forgiveness connect to justice? Because you also mentioned it's about retributive justice. And especially what we've seen in the last couple of years with, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, or if we want to relate it to something that I know that you've been working on a lot recently, gender dynamics and power relations with regards to gender differences. Do you think there is an aspect to include about justice in order to reach something like forgiveness or reconciliation, or are these independent, or how do you relate these concepts?
It's a great question, and I think it really is at the crux of many of these conversations. There's a whole conversation called No Peace Without Justice, and they do good work, or they used to at least. I haven't kept up with them for a long time. And there is this schism, in the aftermath of the civil war in Sierra Leone. Human Rights Watch, for example, the big human rights organization, very strongly advocated in favor of prosecuting child soldiers. And I think there is a real, I wouldn't call it conflict, but it's a dilemma, it's a conundrum. How do you square a feeling? And I think most of all, it's a feeling of justice, because there is no objective justice out there in the world. It's whatever we perceive to be just that is just. So how do we kind of respect someone's need, and particularly a victim's need for closure and for, yes, justice, however that person defines that, with a much more, I would say, pragmatic need of having to coexist afterwards. It's a real, I wouldn't call it a dilemma again, because I actually don't see it as two opposing sides. For me personally, and again, I know I'm proselytizing a little bit, so I'm biased. I don't know if I'm biased, but I have an opinion about this, which is, I think it's much more about reframing the notion of justice and moving that away from punitive justice and saying, I mean, in Sierra Leone, for example, I think we have so much to learn from Sierra Leone. And I'd like to point that out, because no one ever would consider that anyone would have anything to learn from one of the poorest, most malfunctioning countries in the world. But I actually think we do. And one of the ways is former victims and perpetrators of the civil war there would be brought together, would be to say, you burned down our house, for example. It's only fair that you now spend some time helping us plow a new field, or rebuild our house, or mend you make an effort to. The man you mentioned before that I wrote a book about, he's had to put in quite a bit of work to mend the relationships with the victims that he wronged in the war. And so I think those are much more meaningful ways of, pursuing justice. There's a Norwegian scholar, I think an activist, who's a criminologist, I guess, is that the word, who's talked about how in the criminal system of most democracies, the way you pursue justice really is you allocate it to the state. You've been wronged, you've been stolen from, or beaten up, or cheated in one way or another, and then you allocate the responsibility for creating justice to the state, who will then prosecute and make sure that person goes to jail, gets a fine, or whatever it is. But it's completely detached from you, the victim. It makes sense to me, because that's how you can scale that whole system of justice, but it doesn't seem to be a particularly
satisfactory.
Satisfactory and just meaningful way of making sure that something has gone from being unjust to being just.
Can you see this effect in the, let's call it, Sierra Leonean way of doing justice or of reconciliation?
I don't want to glorify or romanticize Sierra Leone either. I mean, there's horrible cases of mob justice. I've seen small kids beaten up by a mob if they, from stealing little pieces of metal trash, and so I'm not saying it's like Sierra Leone got everything, like let's copy them. And I think there's a caveat here, which is that I think there's reason to believe that this might work more easily in small and more tight-knit, particularly rural, which is what I worked in Sierra Leone, communities, where people actually have relationships with one another and have a much stronger motivation to keep those relationships alive, and where two people's relationship will have a much bigger impact on the rest of the community than is the case for someone living in Mexico City, in one part of the city, and the perpetrator living in another part of the city, and who gives a shit really if you ever meet again, aside from the two of you. I don't know if that answers your question. Perhaps if I can just pick up on, you mentioned both the Black Lives Matter aspect and the gender aspect, and I think the racial component of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and the gender component are very important. The writer Roxane Gay has written about how Black people in America, and particularly Black women, are expected to be the bigger person and to forgive just kind of out of hand, whereas no one would ever expect a white man who's been mugged on the street, particularly by, let's say, a black man, to just readily forgive him. There was an interesting case some years ago with lunatic who went into a Southern Baptist church, I think it was in South Carolina perhaps, and shut up this whole church on a Sunday morning, and I think he killed 9 people, you might remember. Dylan Roof was his name. And the very next day, a group of, some of whom had been present at the church, all of them black churchgoers, by the way, and some of the relatives of those who had been killed came out the very next day and said, "We forgive this man," coming from a very strongly religious place. And that led to a lot of internal debate in the black community, African American community, about how expectations for forgiveness are racialized and weaponized by different groups. And I think with gender, as you bring up, it's something I've done a lot of work on, gender relations, I guess we could call it, over the past years. And it's one of the things, I don't know how to phrase this in a way that I won't be shouted down. Luckily, I'm not on Twitter, but wherever people might find me to shut me down or shout me down. But I actually think it's a real risk in the whole Me Too movement and in this kind of time of reckoning that we have right now, which I fully support. But I do think there's very little space for redeeming oneself as a man. I think there's such a focus on justice, as you mentioned, and on holding people accountable, which again, I'm fully supportive of holding people accountable, but it leaves very little space for the conversation that I actually think is the most important conversation, which is how do we make sure that people, and men specifically, don't act in this way again? How do we change the mindsets of men? And I think that we may have been able to kind of scare off a lot of men, or scare a lot of men into thinking twice before they grab someone's ass on a dance floor or whatever bad behavior they might have engaged in. But I'm afraid that it hasn't really led to the kind of reflection that is really needed and that we would really want. And for someone high profile man who's been caught up in this and who's done something bad, come out and say, you know what, I fucked up. I was so immersed in the toxic masculinity of the patriarchy, and I considered women to be less worthy of respect, and I enjoyed my place in the top of the pyramid as a man, and that's fucked up. And I realize that now. And the way I realized that was through, whatever conversations or prison therapy or whatever it might have been, but to kind of explain, having gone through that personal growth, I think that's what's needed much more than that high profile person going to prison, denying he ever did anything wrong, getting out or getting a fine or whatever, and then coming out on the other side entirely unchanged and just more hardened in his distaste for feminism, more egalitarian gender views. So anyways, I'm ranting again now, but I do fear that that's a missed opportunity in the gender dynamic in our, at least Western societies right now, that it would be really beneficial to have more restorative justice approach to being able to think about how, because men and women will have to coexist for centuries to come.
Maybe there's a time thing there. Considering centuries of unequal power relations, maybe there is a longer moment needed for this to occur, right? I mean, considering the newness of something like the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matters for that matter. I mean, the newness on this scale, maybe just needs more time for people to be more conciliatory than less in demand of vengeance.
I think I at some point said to someone, I would never say this in public, which I just now said in public, because I actually think you're right. That, and it's not really my place to pass judgment on that right now. I think simply, and this is something I've thought a lot about, that there are things where, as a white, cis, mostly heterosexual male, you might think that you figured something out, and you might think that there's something that would work in a better way. And you're probably wrong about that. But even if you are right, it's not necessarily constructive to bring that in here. And I think this might be one of those instances where I do genuinely believe that there's an opportunity that's not really being seized upon here to approach this whole gender dynamic in a more restorative way. But I recognize that there's perhaps, exactly like you say, there's too much hurt. There's too long of a history of power imbalance for this to be the moment for that, perhaps. And so I try to wait it out, and hopefully the time comes at some point.
Well, we hope that it will come at some point, hopefully rather sooner than later. Before we come to a close on this very interesting conversation, would you like to add something on what your hope for for reconciliation on a broader level is?
Yes, my hope is really that it would be available to more people to have that reflection of why people behave the way they do, including themselves. I think the world would be a much kinder place if we were all, and I'm including myself, it's not like I have this superpower, but if we were all able to a large extent, just reflect on why people behave they do, including when they do things we don't agree with or that hurt us or that are unjust. And the more we can kind of understand why those people behave, or those people being myself as well, behave the way we do, easier it is to meet them in a restorative, reconciliatory way. That doesn't mean brushing away the wrong that has been caused, or saying that unjust things or unjust acts are in fact just. We should certainly, stand very firm in the face of injustice and say this is not right and it needs to be different. But you can say something that's not right and still meet the person in a more conciliatory way. And again, I realize that I sound like a preacher man now, but I do think that would cause such a tremendous positive change in the way we engage with one another and ourselves.
Jakob, thank you so much for these slightly preaching, but nonetheless beautiful and very important words. And I hope that we can all practice our forgiveness every day to ourselves, to somebody else, whoever we want to or need to forgive at some point. It will be important for the bettering of the world and for a more peaceful, just, and equal coexistence of us as a human species. And as you said, Jakob, we will have to coexist for some time, at least in the near and intermediate future. So practice some forgiveness today. Thank you, Jakob, and thank you guys for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel. And if you like this episode, or if you want to learn more about inequalities, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking, sharing, commenting, asking us for different topics or questions if you want to. And join us again next Saturday for another episode. This program is presented by Traces.Dreams, and we hope that you have a nice day. See you soon. Bye-bye.